Gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the University of Hong Kong Libraries. I'm Y.C. Wen, I'm the acting librarian. Tonight we have Professor Westad with us to talk about his new book, The Penguin History of the World, 6th edition. So to start, may I invite Professor Roberts to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, YC. Now, is this thing switched on? Yes, okay, good. Unlike Ronald Reagan, I'm not going to be announcing the start of World War III on this, but even so. Now, I'd like to begin this evening by thanking Paul Tam, in particular, the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, for making it possible for us to have Arnie Westad here at all tonight. Paul Tam, several years ago, invented a new scheme called the Visiting Research Professor Scheme, whereby eminent academics would be invited to spend up to 2 months a year at Hong Kong U for several years, encouraging research. We were never quite told exactly how they were to encourage research, but history has been extremely lucky in having first Professor Chen Zhen of Cornell University and now Professor Arnie Westad of LSE as our visiting research professors. I don't think that Paul is here tonight, but this is very much something that he dreamed up out of nowhere, and I think it's an absolutely great scheme. I would also like to thank Daniel Chua and the staff in the School of Humanities office, all of whom have been great in handling the arrangements for Professor Westad's stay here, and Andy Leung in our own office, who has had to deal with a lot of the practicalities. Now, over the past few years, I have had the good fortune of introducing quite a number of eminent historians in this university at big public lectures. Wang Gungwu, Chen Zhen, last year Lord Briggs, of whom Arnie in some ways reminds me. Now you may ask, what does a rather large Norwegian in his 50s have in common with a short Yorkshireman of 92? Well, apart from the fact that they're both very good friends of mine, they are both academics who've got an enormous range of interests and have had very distinguished careers as administrators and as institution builders, while remaining extremely prolific and productive historians. And both are, I think, by now legends in their profession. So I've been very lucky in getting to introduce to people in Hong Kong some of my very best friends under this scheme. I'm particularly pleased to be here tonight in the library because I am a long-standing member of what I suppose might be called the Library Fan Club. I believe that libraries are a very important part of any university, and I think that Arnie too shares this belief, and probably many of the people sitting around this room tonight. We sometimes, particularly perhaps in the humanities and social sciences, don't succeed quite as well as we might wish in getting this message through to university higher-ups and perhaps also to people in other fields. So a little while ago, some of us became very concerned about the state of the university library, and we got together a petition. That petition you will find on the library website. It was started just 3 days ago. We're already up to 353 signatures the last time I looked, but those of you with personal communication devices might care to keep track of it. We keep on watching as it goes over another 50 and another 100 mark. I was the first person to sign it. Peter Koenig over there was the second. Arnie got in a little bit later, in between a very crowded schedule in Hong Kong. I would like to say a little bit about the library before I actually get started on properly introducing Arnie. In the past 20 to 30 years, this library has been built up into a really great and outstanding library. I would like to pay particular tribute to the efforts of two great librarians, Dr. Gan Lai Bing, once described to me by her then deputy librarian as a field marshal among librarians, and Dr. Tony Ferguson, her successor, and their excellent and hard-working staff, who labored long and hard to make this library into one of the best, perhaps the best in Asia, in terms of its combination of both Western language and Chinese language resources. Their successor, Peter Sidorko, has also labored valiantly, trying to maintain and build on this legacy against ever-increasing difficulties, which I won't go into now because we've got a petition that tells you all about them up on the website. And the facts there are, I promise you, accurate. What I would like to say is that this library is a magnet that attracts visitors from far and beyond, from far beyond Hong Kong. For quite a few years, I ran a program bringing in mainland Chinese scholars and students to this library. They talked about one of them called the Treasure of Academic Resources. He was one of a group of 4 students from BayY who was here 3 or 4 years ago. But he said, the Hong Kong U Library impressed us in another way. We were surprised and touched by the kindness and seriousness with which the Hong Kong U librarians responded to our requests. They were particularly touched that when they couldn't find a book they wanted on the shelves and it was missing, the librarians would get their mobile phone numbers and phone them when they'd located the books. To be frank, as students, we had not expected that kind of service, which is really something unexpected in a library on the mainland. So in private, we joked that our stay in Hong Kong U gave us a taste of the so-called life with high dignity. Another spoke of the full-hearted service I received from the Library of Hong Kong U. It is a library that is distinguished not just by the excellence of its collections, but by the excellence of its outstanding staff, who have been working incredibly hard over the years to make it a place where it is a pleasure to work, not just a good library, but a library with stunning staff. And so I should perhaps say that, best of all, one of them said, the Library of Hong Kong U is just like a paradise with endless new discoveries and excitements. Now, eminent visitors, as Jay Winter mentioned when he spoke here a few weeks ago, can need care, attention, and entertainment. But I have to say that Arnie is a very easy person to look after, because if ever I'm busy, I don't have to worry about him twiddling his thumbs and needing to be entertained. All I have to do is send him to the library, and know he'll be quite happy here for as long as we are prepared to leave him here. Every man should have a hobby to get him out of your hair. Arnie's is the library. When he arrived here, the very first thing he asked me to do for him was to get him a library card, and then disappeared to the library to get himself legal as fast as he could. So the library, I think, has been of great service to you. And you've been able to find a lot of things here that you couldn't find at any library in London. And so I hope that on this trip, you have not just encouraged research, you've even been able to do some research, which your burden of administration in London makes sometimes rather difficult. Now, Arnie actually has very long connections with Hong Kong U, dating back to the 1980s, and his time doing research at the Centre of Asian Studies. I didn't actually meet him then, but he did come out here for the first of several big conferences that I have run dealing with the Cold War in collaboration with the Cold War International History Project here in 1996. I hadn't known him before then. He immediately marked himself out from the 40 or so other scholars who came here for that conference because it was reported back to me before I'd even met him in person. Oh yes, Arnie Westard is here. He was travelling, arrived at some godforsaken hour of the morning at Robert Black College and climbed over the wall. So I thought, well, what a good thing he's fit and that somebody was from the Cold War Project was actually around to help him get in. Now, 8 years ago, Peter Kunick, my colleague who was then head of the department, asked me for suggestions for who would be a good external examiner for history. And he said, well, Priscilla, what we want is, first of all, of course, they really need to know something about China and Asia as well. And we could do with somebody who knows a good deal about Western history. And because we're doing a lot more now on social and cultural history as well as political and economic, they need to know about that as well. So I said, yes, Peter, what a paragon we're looking for. Anything else? A few other minor requirements? And then one Sunday morning, I went out for a walk and I suddenly thought, Arnie Westard. And so I suggested him, and the department thought that this was a good idea. But when he arrived, I think you may have met one or two other people in the department besides me, but no one else in the department really knew him. So he spent most of his first day meeting with my various colleagues, talking about their work and their courses with him. And as they left after those meetings, they all kept on dropping into my office saying, guess what? I've just met our external examiner. And he's really a good scholar, and also he's a really nice man. So I was smugly saying, well, yes, all my friends are very nice. Oh, and he's just won the Bancroft Prize. So we felt that he was an external examiner who really did us credit. Now, I should tell you a little bit about Arnie's background. I've been working out what great things and people have come out of Norway, where he started out. Smoked salmon, the Vikings, who, I must admit, ravaged the part of England where I'm probably descended from them.
They're much misunderstood, I must say.
Quite so. They really all peaceable farmers, and all they wanted to do was to settle down, probably with the local girls. A slightly gloomy playwright, Henrik Ibsen, the explorers Roald Amundsen and Thor Heyerdahl, among others. Arnie came out of Norway. He studied first at the University of Oslo and then did his PhD at the University of North Carolina with the very distinguished scholar Michael Hunt. He became director of research at the Nobel Institute in Oslo and then moved to LSE in London to the Department of International History. And he's been one of the founders and co-director of IDEAS, which for you, those of you who don't know your acronyms, is the Institute for the Study of International Affairs, Diplomacy and Strategy. And he has built that institute up into an outstanding institute. Arnie is well known for being fairly outspoken. I just found something on a blog a few minutes ago, which I printed out as we were on our way down. LSE Ideas is such a hive of activity nowadays, I don't even manage to keep up with what the boss is up to. Of course, he isn't odd. It's a Norwegian name.
I hadn't seen that.
Oh, well, I'll give it to you later. However, it's commenting on a piece that Arnie published, I think last December or January on Sino-Japanese relations. And it says, given that we've been hosting Chinese foreign ministry officials at IDEAS via the Chevening Scholarship Program for a few years now, I am still surprised how forthright he is, while I would have been circumspect about doing so. I suppose academic integrity still counts for something in the highly commercialized world of higher education, and perhaps you don't build a reputation mincing words. There's a lesson in there somewhere. I'll let you have that before you leave. Arnie is known, became known first of all as a scholar of the Cold War. Many of you will know his first two books on World War II and the Chinese Civil War, Cold War and Revolution, and Decisive Encounters. He then produced the Global Cold War in 2005 that won the Bancroft Prize, as well as several others. He has, in fact, been one of the pioneers of international history, particularly the international multi-archival, multidisciplinary history of the Cold War. I won't tell you all his edited books, of which there are many as well, but he has been co-editor of the 3-volume history of the Cold War, keeping a stable of, I think, a mere 84 academics or thereabouts in order, and getting them all to produce their chapters according to the requirements of this particular work. He is certainly widely recognized as a leading authority in the Cold War field, and his knowledge of it is almost encyclopedic. One study that appeared in 2008 referred to Arnie Westad, whose name seems to appear in the acknowledgements page of every book written on a topic relating to the Cold War. More recently, he has spread his net more widely and produced the book Restless Empire, China and the World since 1750. Since he's spoken on that twice in Hong Kong during his trip here and once in Macau, and since I also listened to him lecture at LSE about it, I decreed that I was not going to listen to him again on Restless Empire. And so his revised version of the Penguin History of the World had his very latest book came out literally this month while he is here, and that is going to be the topic of tonight's talk. We've decided on a slightly unconventional format for tonight's talk. Arne is not so much going to give a lecture and then do Q&A. I'm going to start out by asking him one or two or maybe even 3 questions, which he will do his best to answer. Of course, as I once said when asked to say a few words at my father's 80th birthday party, well, the good thing about academics is that you just press a button and we speak for 50 minutes without even pausing for breath, eloquently and fluently. My brothers looked a bit worried and said, well, look, some of these people are a bit elderly. They may need to get out to use the facilities. Do you think we could have the jet-propelled version? But I'm sure that Arnie will have a good deal to tell us about writing this book. As I said, he moved from fairly focused projects to slightly broader projects to what is really quite a big subject, the history of the world. It's rather like having the reduced Shakespeare Company here giving a show tonight. Somebody said, is he going to tell you all about it in 37 minutes? So perhaps I can start off by saying, well, yes, the history of the world is actually quite a big subject to tackle. How did you set about doing this, deciding what to include and what not to include, and how to organize the history of the world from the beginning to now?
Sure. Well, that's a fairly broad question as well, Priscilla. But let me start first by thanking you for organizing my visit here in many at many different levels, and in a wonderful way. I mean, you are a true friend and someone who's helped out enormously in setting this up, and I appreciate that very, very much. Also, my thanks to the history department, fine history department. I'm very privileged to get to know it now over several years. It's a history department that could hold its own anywhere in the world. And I just wanted to have a couple of quick comments on the library, because what Priscilla said is absolutely true. And this is an outstanding library. Not everyone, I think, in Hong Kong, maybe not even everyone at this university, realize what an outstanding resource it is. And of course, it's first and foremost because of the people who work here, but it's also because of the collections. And the collections are quite unique. I mean, this is the strongest language for English materials in the whole region. But it's also a fabulous Chinese library, which is the one that I mainly use when I'm here. And that is the part that I think often is not understood, is how good the Chinese sections of this library are, and how well they have been built over a long period of time. So I do really hope that this institution and this city will set off enough funding to keep these collections up. I mean, in Britain we know a great deal about building great libraries, but we also know how difficult it is to keep libraries up when they start declining because of a lack of resources, which is basically what happened in many British libraries in the 1980s and the first part of the 1990s. It takes a very long time to repair that, very long time to deal with it, and it's costly. It's much more cost effective to put money into a gradual, regular expansion of libraries than trying to catch up later with all the materials that you haven't bought when you ought to buy them. So that's my my point on the library and on its uses. I think it's one of the many reasons why I decided to come here for parts of the year, is because of the library resources that this university has. And libraries, of course, play a very important role when you're trying to write big history as well. How do you go about doing it? Well, you start out, of course, by reading a lot. That's what this is very much about. There's a great historian at Chicago now, I guess approaching 100, William McNeill, who has what he calls History 101. I mean, how do you actually do history? Well, you start by reading, then you write a little bit, just enough so that you realize how much you don't know. And then you go back to reading, and you read much more than what you originally did or thought you needed to do, you see. And then you do a little bit of writing again, and this goes back and forth, and very, very soon you have a book that's come out of it. That's Bill McNeill's History 101, and I think that is very true. Now, doing a book like this is different. I mean, we'll get on to, I think, a little bit later, Priscilla, the challenges of working on what is a pre-existing manuscript. But in terms of structure, what I had to do was decide to myself, what are the principles I'm going to work according to? In other words, what is the history that really matters for today's readers? And that's particularly important with this book, because this is the most sold, most read history of the world in history. It's sold, I think, now something like 750,000 copies worldwide. And it was also originally written by an historian who I much respect, John Roberts, who was very clear on this, which, pardon me, is a view that I very much agree with. If you want to write a history of the world for the general reader, you have to take as your starting point their understanding, their need to understand the world that we live in today. So a history of the world of that sort will need to deal with what created the world that we live in now. And that is already a way of setting priorities, you see, in terms of what you want to do. You deal with the general rather than the specific. You deal with those trends that have lasted for a very long period of time up to our own day, and therefore had a very direct impact on how people live their lives today. You deal with issues that are universal in terms of the implications. That's the kind of stuff that you'll be dealing with. Now, that's not the same thing as forgetting that there is a much wider history, including a history of those cultural and social projects that didn't come, at least not in a very direct way, to influence today's world. They should not be forgotten. But they are, I believe, of less importance than those that really came to influence how we live our lives today. And so that's the priority, really, that I've been setting for this kind of book. You have to have some kind of manner by which you discriminate. Because if not, this book wouldn't have been 1,300 pages. It would have been 13,000 pages, or several volumes. And then my publisher and my agent would really have had a fit, you see. So couldn't do that. We have to keep it to about 1,300 pages, and we did that by having a fairly structured approach.
Right. Well, you've mentioned. Sorry. You have mentioned that this was, to begin with, another historian's book, and so you've had to take a text, an existing text by somebody else, and revise it. How do you go about that? What are the challenges? Do you feel that it is now your book or John Roberts' book? And what's new or different about it?
Well, I mean, let me say first that part of the reason why I was so keen to do this when Penguin asked me, because it's not an easy task. I mean, it's not an easy job to do this kind of revision, is that this is one of the first history books that I myself read. I picked it up. I remember I grew up in a small fishing town on the west coast of Norway, and I picked this up when I must have been about 15 or 16 or something like that, and read it and thought it was marvelous. I thought it was fantastic. I thought this was, this is the kind of history that really makes me interested in reading history. So that made it very hard to turn down when Simon Window at Penguin then offered me the opportunity to pick it up and to revise it. I also knew John Roberts not well, and I had a tremendous admiration for him as an historian. So how do you do it? Well, what you have to do first, of course, is to be reasonably clear to yourself about the directions that you want to go in. I mean, what is it that you think needs to be revised? And this is a complete revision. I mean, there is this is not just slipping in a few pages here or there. This is a reworking of the full text. So you have to come up with some kind of priorities. Now, we are lucky, as I said already, in the sense that the overall approach that John Roberts had for his book is one that I very much agree with. Emphasizing the general, emphasizing the long-term trends, trying to explain history by understanding human motives. That's something that's important for both of us. But of course, historical knowledge has developed quite a bit since John first wrote that book back in the mid-1970s. It was published in the mid-70s. He started work on it in the late 1960s. All works of history are children of their age. One of the things I like to teach my students is to judge by its content roughly when an historical text would be written, you see. Because there is always an impact of the issues that are being discussed in that time and age, in how historians perceive the past. And that's absolutely true for John Roberts as well. So I wanted to expand it from that. I wanted, of course, more, and there is a bit of tension on this, I must say, I mean, to be honest about it. I wanted more on the non-European world. John Roberts was first and foremost an historian of Europe, and a very, very good one. That doesn't mean that in his first edition of this text he neglected the rest of the world. But much of the scholarship that has been developing since then has put us in a much better position to deal, say, with Asian history, which has been one of my main fields of interest, or for that matter, Middle Eastern, African, Latin American history. So I wanted to expand that part of it. I wanted to expand prehistory, which may sound a bit funny coming from an historian who himself has mainly worked on the 20th century. But again, it is a result of the knowledge that we have. The modern study of genetics, especially human DNA, has entirely transformed our understanding of prehistory in a way that goes very far beyond anything that could have been picked up in the 1970s. So we spent quite a bit of time on that. I spent much more time than I thought I would on parts of agricultural history because I think it is important. I've spent much more time on migrations of various sorts, again, than I thought I would. This is what you discover when you work on something like this, is, you know, how things have developed, how history, the study of history has developed in various directions that you haven't been aware of. It's an enormous privilege to be able to do something like this. You know, I could, for the first time, I think, ever in my professional career, I could read freely. I could walk into a great library like this one and I could say, okay, now today I want to look at the period of the Great Migrations, you know, in the 5th to the 8th century. Or I could look at DNA research to find out where these people had moved. I mean, that's also a very important part of it. I had to learn new languages, not normal day-to-day human languages, but the languages of scientists and medical people on some of this, which I started doing quite early in the process. And I've also worked quite a bit on things like the history of Byzantium, the Byzantine history, which is very often overlooked in general historical texts. I spent a lot of time working on the 16th century, and part of the reason for that is that I think, a bit against John, that it is very, very important. I mean, what happens in the 16th century revolutionizes how a lot of people see the world that they live in, and that has a direct bearing on us today, you see. So there are some tensions and differences. I mean, often call writing a book together with someone who is no longer with us. John Roberts died in 2003. As sometimes being a very friendly quarrel. Now, of course, I win that quarrel most of the time. Exactly, I'm still around. But sometimes he wins through sheer obstinacy. I mean, I go through this in the preface. Because he was the first one to shape this manuscript, and there are some things that he is very, very preoccupied with. One of the things that I don't think he ever got much credit for, actually, when this was first published, is that he's one of the first great historians of his generation who took women's history very seriously, and the book is very much influenced by that. So, you know, when you talk about especially the 19th and 20th century, much of his emphasis there had been kept, even though I think there are other aspects of human history in general that probably ought to have been covered more in depth. So those are, you know, it's a dialogue, friendly quarrel, whatever. It's a process of give and take, because you know that you have, you know, exactly 1,350 pages available.
Yes, well, I should perhaps mention that Arnie and I somehow managed to review each other's books and remain friends. Frank DeCotter in our department said it was absolutely fatal to go reviewing your friends' books. But we've somehow managed that so far, even though I've occasionally disagreed with him on things. Well, I'll ask one more question before throwing this open to questions from the audience as well. Another very challenging task, I think in a different way, you faced was putting together the Cambridge history of the Cold War. I did occasionally hear the odd comment from John Thompson and his wife in Cambridge about what was happening with you and Mel Leffler, trying to get it all into one kind of format. but can you compare the two tasks at all? Obviously, another big topic, one in which new information is coming out all the time. The history of the Cold War is, I think it's fair to say, under reassessment all the time, has been for the last 20 years, and will no doubt continue to be for many decades yet. So can you tell us a bit about that and how the two tasks compare?
I can tell you, certainly to begin with, which one was the most pleasant. And that was not the Cambridge history of the Cold War. Now, I worked with some wonderful people, Mel and I, Mel Leffler, Professor Melvin Leffler at University of Virginia, and myself, who were the general editors for that series. Worked with some wonderful historians, and I was deeply impressed by the scholarship that they produced. But as Priscilla alluded to, it's just a very, very difficult task to work with a large group of historians to try to get the practicalities right, make sure that they hand in their manuscripts on time, and maybe first and foremost that they speak to each other. That there is some kind of, this is not just a artificially constructed collection of essays. These are chapters that are supposed to reflect an area of knowledge with regard to our understanding of the Cold War, and therefore also address each other's scholarship. I mean, to have a certain understanding of how these various chapters relate. Now, that's very difficult. It's very difficult overall to edit anything that anyone else has written. Very often it takes much more time, in my experience, than actually do the writing yourself. So it was a big task. I must say, as I think I said at the launch in London, that when I was asked by someone in the audience, would I ever do this again? I think the answer is very clearly no. Was it worth it? I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, I'm quite proud, and I know Mel is too, at the way the Cambridge history of the Cold War came out, and I think it will be a very useful work for students, both undergraduate and postgraduate students, and for young academics who set out in, as Priscilla said, this expanding universe of Cold War historiography. I mean, which will be a very important topic for a long time to come. So I'm happy with that. But it was much more pleasant to work on this one. Because I've always been interested in discovering new fields of history that really appeals to me. I mean, those that are beyond what I work on myself at the moment, where there is new scholarship that has been developed. And the main reason for that is not just new evidence that is brought in, though that is important too. It is mainly because it teaches me a lot about how historians think. I mean, within fields that I haven't really covered myself earlier on in any meaningful way, or not to mention never done research on, which of course is the vast majority of topics covered in the Penguin history of the world. It's that process of thinking that I'm really interested in. I mean, that is what draws me in to the many fields in that book that I have never really addressed myself in any meaningful way. It's about tricks of the trade. It's about learning how you approach a big research program. It is about trying to understand how things relate to each other, how they link. For instance, I had a wonderful discussion at lunch today, building on something that I write quite a bit about in this book, with one of your colleagues here at Hong Kong U, Ron Hill, who is one of the leading scholars on the history of rice cultivation. And that is something that is reflected very much, I think, in how I've written this book, that, very often having a conversation with someone, because there are limits of how much time you have. I mean, you can read up on quite a bit on it, but then you take it from there. And this is the great thing about being based in London, or between London and Cambridge that I am. You can always find people to talk to when you need a little shortcut, you know, you can always rustle up someone who really knows something about this and care about it enough to talk to. I'm really struck when I've been doing this work, and it just shows how incredibly lucky I am, many of us are working in academia. What a generous profession it is, after all. I mean, people may end up attacking each other's points of view or write negative reviews, so there might be history departments from hell out there in terms of how they do not cooperate with each other. But overall, it's a remarkably generous profession. I mean, in terms of people being willing to share the knowledge with people they have just met, and to spend several hours explaining to someone like me the history of rice cultivation, or the intricacies of understanding the early peopling of Europe, or, as in one case, to explain how diet has influenced human development over time. I mean, the significance of food. So, you know, we are very lucky after all, aren't we?
Well, I think that at this point, I will ask if there are people in the audience who've got their own questions for Professor Westad. Two things I would like to say. First of all, don't start speaking until the mic reaches you, because we're all being recorded for posterity. This is your chance for your 15 minutes of fame. And secondly, if you could perhaps identify yourselves before asking a question, that would be great. So, are there any questions? Peter.
Arnie, it's good to see you back in Hong Kong.
Good to see you, Peter.
We've been using the Penguin History of the World now for many years in the department as a first-year textbook for our world history courses. And I was delighted with the last edition to see your name on the cover. And I immediately went to it trying to find where Arnie Westad's opinions were. And it must have been so seamlessly done that I couldn't actually find Arnie Westad in there. I just wonder whether in this version, this edition, it's going to be easier to see the differences between Roberts and Westad. And perhaps at a deeper level, whether that really matters at all. Because this to me seems to be a different sort of history. It's not a single person's history, it can't possibly be. Does it really matter whose history it is when it's trying to achieve such a huge goal?
Those are very good questions, Peter. I mean, with the last edition, my own influence on it, impact on it, is quite limited. That was a question first and foremost of editing John Roberts' text, and then updating, in effect, the two last books. The history is divided into 8 books of the text as he left it. So you would probably be looking in that one for much of what I had to say, though I did get in the point, I think, right at the end of what a disaster the Iraq and Afghanistan interventions had been. Even in the last edition, I developed that a little bit further in this edition, Peter. This one is very different in many ways. I mean, it's there are not many parts of it that are entirely the way John wrote them. There are some, but not very many. I think on some of the big issues where you will see changes, where it's important, I think, for what is presented, not least to your students, as a unitary history of the world, that it doesn't move in too many different directions in terms of interpretation. For instance, since I mentioned the 16th, I probably should also mention the 15th century. I think one point where John and I did disagree, and it's an important point, is about the origins and the causes of European global predominance. John saw that as, at least to some extent, coming out of a continual, never easy, always threatened, but still continual process or set of processes that go back to European antiquity. That there is something in the European tradition that goes back to Greece and especially, and to some extent Rome, in terms of modes of thinking that came to privilege Europe over other continents. I do not believe that that is the case. And that is part of the reason why I focus so much in on the 15th and the 16th centuries, you see. Because I think, like many historians of my generation, that the European predominance that lasted for a few centuries, a relatively short period in historical terms overall, came about mainly because of changes that took place in Europe during those centuries. And that it was these changes that came to privilege Europe over other continents for a certain period of time. I think it's important to focus in on change in Europe during that period. This is not a point in terms of John's takes, but many historians, as many of you here will know, are talking about the decay and decline and collapse elsewhere. To me, that is not the center of the story. The center of the story is that Europe changed in a very dramatic fashion and for a very short period of time. In terms of military technology, maybe first and foremost, so that it could attack the rest of the world. But also in terms of energy and in terms of different modes of production that were put forward. Or I should rather say small parts of Europe changed. I mean, that is where the change really took place. The large majority of European areas stayed, for instance, where I'm from, stayed remarkably similar to what was happening in the rest of the world for a very, very long time. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are, I mean, those kinds of things, in my view, you have to unify to some extent. I mean, you have to, if you want to use this book successfully with undergraduates, and I know of many departments that use it as a kind of primer for world history, then you have to have a certain direction. You shouldn't hide where historians disagree, but you don't want the text to disagree with itself.
More questions? Well, I've certainly got another one for you. I've never asked you really about this. I think that fairly early in your career, you spent quite a lot of time working with aid agencies in Pakistan and Africa. I suppose I have two questions, actually. What made you switch from being, say, an international civil servant of some kind to being a historian? And the other is, what kind of impact did those experiences have on your thinking about history, specifically perhaps in this book, but also in your other works as well?
Yeah. Well, I think I was always interested in history, though I never really thought that it would or could become a profession. I'm from a family that has no academic traditions whatsoever. I mean, I'm actually the first one in my family ever to attend high school. And that meant that you don't sort of start thinking about an academic career first and foremost. I mean, you start thinking about getting a job. And I was very lucky because some of the stuff that I did when I was an undergraduate student, in terms of working in voluntary organizations, then developed into an actual job that people would pay me to do. So I worked for a while, as you said, in Southern Africa, and particularly with projects that were based there. For much of the time, I actually went back and forth quite a bit. And then later on in Pakistan, working with Afghan refugees at the height of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. I think at the end, I found that work very difficult. I mean, I think to some extent, when you worked on that for a while, the human tragedies that you have to confront, that you have to deal with, your inability to help effectively, or at least effectively enough, makes it hard. I mean, it's not just for me. I think for quite a few people, make it very hard to envisage going on doing this forever. So I started looking for something else to do. And then I got very lucky because I was offered, through Michael Hunt, a scholarship to study at the University of North Carolina. I mean, that was in part because I already had languages, which quite useful, I think, for a young historian to do. I mean, again, that's a point for those of you here who have an interest in doing graduate work in history, already doing it. Emphasize languages, stress languages. They are terribly important if you want to be an historian, for whatever history you do. So I was lucky in that respect, important being lucky simply having grown up in a small country on the outskirts of Europe where you had to learn foreign languages if you wanted to do anything. Then I was also, I think, drawn to history, Priscilla, because I've always been so incredibly curious. I mean, you know, about finding out about things, and perhaps especially finding out about some of the things that I myself had worked on or observed earlier on. Therefore, the Cold War, I think. That was the background. I mean, and that's, as you will know, very much how the book, The Global Cold War, was actually written. I mean, it took me a while to get there, but that is the book that is about the things that I was so curious to find out when I was working as an aid worker in Africa and in South Asia. And then many years later, it was possible to actually go back and look at the archives, look at the materials to tell us, you know, what the people who I had been, in many ways, on the opposing side of, at least in terms of what I was trying to do, were up to. I mean, what they were thinking, what their motives were, how this actually worked. So I think that's what drew me into this. And a high degree of curiosity. Certainly didn't always think that I wanted to be an historian, but I must say that, you know, as I already said, I mean, having read when I was quite young, work by John Roberts and others convinced me that there might be something there that could be transformed from being an occupation, a hobby, an interest in terms of reading to actually become a profession. Hi.
Hi, Vodine, England. When John Roberts was writing this, you said late 60s, early 70s. It was just at the very beginning of, I mean, it seems to me I'm only just learning it myself now, I'm ignorant, of what we now call a field of world history and or global history, depending on what you prefer. And so McNeill, who you mentioned, had just been writing his Rise of the West and so on. And so it was really the sort of beginning of a whole new phase and people looking again at the big sweep and reaching new conclusions. So, and then you come along in a way a generation later. And with, I mean, you've already mentioned that some of the things that you wanted to add in that were different to what Roberts had seen as important. But the way that historiography had shifted over that generation must have made a big impact on the work you had to do, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, the shifts in the historiography, the shifts in the points of view, places of view, I mean, how you see history, obviously influenced me in terms of what I was trying to do with the revision. I mean, there are very clear generations in history, in historical knowledge, in historiography. Though it would be entirely wrong, of course, to say that you could categorize people by generation. There are enormous disagreements within each generation as well, but there tend to be a certain set of issues that people are preoccupied with. Very often, they're divided by how they view those issues. But still, when you look back on historiography, it is fascinating to see how those issues change from generation to generation, but within that generation, the preoccupations, not the methodologies, not the answers, but the preoccupations tend to be remarkably similar across the board and across national boundaries as well. So of course I had to take all of that into consideration. I also had to make up my own mind about it. I'm very deeply skeptical of the use of labels in history, or often referred to as historical schools. Maybe because I never found an historical school I really wanted to belong to myself in any way. And I also find that when you start looking at these, both in terms of schools and in terms of the general terminology, you really find that they dissolve. I mean, there aren't. People may have some methodological approaches in common. They may, such as postmodern historians, for instance, would have. They would be preoccupied with some of the same matters, but in terms of the execution of this, there's still an enormous variation. I mean, in terms of how it is carried out, what kind of subjects are studied, most importantly, what kind of conclusions are drawn. World history as a way of doing history, I mean, looking at what I think of when I say world history, which really means very large developments in different parts of the world that happen roughly at the same time, develop in parallel, often with very different outcomes. But trying to get closer to that is infinitely stronger today as a sub-discipline than what it has been in the past. And that has obviously influenced my own work. But so are many other approaches. And, think about what we've learned about what's gone into a book like this from medical history, for instance. Or from history that deals with young people. And what I think is most striking about history up to the time when John Roberts, maybe a little bit earlier, when Bill McNeill was starting to do his work, is the absence of children and young people from our understanding of history. By the time John started writing, as I've already said, women's history was already starting to develop. So he caught on to that. But in terms of women, in terms of children and young people, that took quite a long while to be integrated into the general historiography. I also think, in terms of going back to the part of your question, Bodin, about world history. One other approach where things really have changed is, of course, that we have a far larger group of historians now who are able to read and to work in different languages. Now, that to me is essential. And it's particularly useful for anyone who wants to approach world history to be able to work in rather different languages. By which I mean, I guess, not just European languages. And to be able to look at what is happening in terms not just of evidence, but in terms of how historians think and work in a very different culture from our own. And that has been one of the reasons, I think, why I've been so interested in writing the kind of work that goes into the Penguin history, is that I was very lucky in the sense that I was probably among the very first ones in my generation who were able to start picking up on that in a serious manner. And now, of course, maybe this is the problem with doing a Cambridge history and a Penguin history of the world. I'm starting to feel my age. Historians who are younger than me, say a generation younger, are far better at this than what our generation ever was. In terms not just of languages, but also in terms of the cultural sensitivity that goes with this. Having spent a lot of time elsewhere in cultures that are not their own, having had friends or girlfriends or boyfriends who come from a very different cultural background than what they themselves do. This helps enormously when you want to think about approaches to world history.
I'm supposed to keep this one, aren't I?
Sure. Professor Westad, my name is Ming, and I'm a graduate of Hong Kong U. What brings you into the study of Chinese history? And can you tell us a little bit background on your part, because it's quite rare for a European, especially from such a small country,
Yes.
to take such a big interest in a country like this.
That's
Thank
true.
you.
No, I've been tremendously lucky on this because when I started out as an undergraduate at University of Oslo, one of the things that I really benefited from was having very, very good teachers. And I had an early interest in languages. And I also had this incredible sense of freedom that I think comes out of not having a family, not having parents who sort of set you in one particular direction, which certainly was the case with me. I mean, I could taste a lot of what the university had to offer. So I got interested in linguistics. I got interested in comparative linguistics, I guess. And as a part of that process, I more or less stumbled across this wonderful Institute of East Asian Studies at the University of Oslo that really had a very strong Chinese language program. So I started studying with them when I really was signed up to do something entirely different. So that was how my introduction to Chinese language started. I didn't think at that time that I would ever use this as an historian. It was simply for the interest in the language that this began. And it actually took me a very long time to go back, I mean, after several stays in China, mainly in Beijing, to go back and use this as an historian, which also had a lot to do, of course, with the opening of archives and the opening of historical evidence in the People's Republic of China, starting gradually from the mid-1980s on. So I was able to benefit from that enormously. I was also lucky. I mean, I'm struck in this conversation what a role luck often plays in these kinds of things. I was just completing my PhD thesis, working with Michael Hunt at University of North Carolina. I got my first job, which was absolutely necessary because I was out of money, in China in 1989. So I was teaching at the satellite that Johns Hopkins has in Nanjing when the political events of 1989 started. And from my perspective as an historian, this was an absolute godsend because things started to open up much faster than they've ever done before or since in terms of access to historical materials. Now, I felt a little bit strange in Beijing when I was heading off to the archives and all the students were heading downtown to demonstrate. But I felt, I guess, that even though I knew many of the student leaders from 89 and admired them enormously, I didn't think then, or nor do I think today, that it was the task of a foreigner to get involved in what was basically a Chinese campaign for democracy. I mean, I talked to these people, they talked to me or to us, and the foreigners who were present at the time. But this was basically a Chinese movement. So, but what it did, and this enormous heroism and willingness to sacrifice for the country that generation of students showed, was it also pulled me closer to China. I mean, it was at that point, I think, that my interest really in working with Chinese history as one of my specialities came out. So that then goes back to the books that Priscilla mentioned at the beginning. I think, by the way, that the book that I'm most proud of having done is my history of the Chinese Civil War. Both because it was a difficult book to do in terms of the material that I needed to get access to, but also because it is more or less a full reinterpretation of a very significant period in Chinese history, what in many ways created modern China, contemporary China, the China that you live in today. And it was a difficult book to do, but it was also a necessary book to do. I mean, also to quite some extent came out of my experiences in '89 that I wanted to do that book.
So you really get sort of like first-hand knowledge of the country for your interest into the country.
Yes, I mean, I've been tremendously lucky in China. I have a very large number of very good Chinese friends who I've known for a very long time. I've learned more about their country from them, really, than I ever learned through reading. I learned quite a bit through reading as well, but I mean, their insights and their understanding of their own history and their own culture has been essential to me. And it's an ongoing process. I mean, as all of you will know, whether you are Chinese or foreign or whatever, I mean, the study of China is really a lifetime preoccupation. I mean, it's when I started this most recent book that Priscilla mentioned, Restless Empire, my general history of China's interaction with the outside world, really a set of essays that deals with different aspects of China's international affairs since the mid-18th century. I was struck at the very beginning by how difficult it is to define what China is. I mean, if you think about it over a very long period of time, or if you try to think about it outside the culture that it represents, which is almost impossible to do, you know. So yeah, it's an ongoing conversation with China about China, I guess, in my case.
I'm Jenny Chim. I could only find the 5th version of your
Yes.
work.
Well, you can soon buy the 6th one.
Yes, I went to the commercial press, but it's out of stock. Sorry. And then, I didn't have enough time to finish it, but I read through the pages about China. Well, just now the gentleman mentioned it, and it stimulates me to think of a question because in those pages. You suggest that the sense of Chinese nationalism began when China was first unified in the Qin dynasty. Okay, so I mean, may I ask about your comments of the situation nowadays? Because now China, of course, is unified, but we still have some independent ruling states or countries like Hong Kong, Macau, or Taiwan. Okay, so yeah. Please share your comments with us. Thank you.
In that sense, yeah. I think Chinese nationalism is a very strange phenomenon. Some of it, in terms of identity, goes back a very long time. Some of it, in terms of form, is actually quite new, and really a 20th century phenomenon. China, to me, has always been defined first and foremost by its culture, which is a culture that it also gave, to quite some extent, to the rest of its region. It is the root of that common culture, which, of course, has its starting point in a unified, a common written language. Now, this is a very peculiar, I mean, you may be able to call it nationalism, you know, by stretching it a little bit. A dedication to a cultural vision of what China is. That has existed for a very long time and it's been pretty intense at times. But that is not anything that we could really understand as a modern nationalism. I mean, it's very far from European nationalism, for instance, of the 19th century kind, which is about who you are, you know, where it's a sort of an exercise in limitation on the European side. I mean, to be Norwegian or to be German or whatever. It's about where you come from, where your ancestors grew up, what kind of language you speak, different from the language you write. What the Germans often referred to in the 19th century as Blut und Boden, blood and land. Chinese sense of identity up to the 20th century has not been like that. It's been much more open, much more inclusive, much more culturally based. I mean, as late as during the height of the Qing dynasty, it didn't, I mean, when my book about Chinese foreign affairs begins in the mid-18th century, it didn't really matter all that much how you looked or where your ancestors were coming from. If you were male, handled written Chinese, I mean classical Chinese, and was pretty good at it. If you proved yourself a loyal servant of the emperor, you could operate extremely well within China. And if you look at those who advised the great Qianlong emperor, you'll find that they are a very multinational crew of people, not just because of the origins of the dynasty, but also because of people who were drawn in, you know, to this form of service. Now, you could say that's often the case with empires versus nation states, and I do think that is true. I think on the part of your question about Hong Kong and Macau, or possibly also Taiwan, I mean, the fact that there are many Chinas in a way, but only one China. I mean, there's only, you know, there are many Chinese societies, but at the same time, the People's Republic of China, in terms of its size, in terms of the territory that it controls, is so overwhelmingly predominant that it doesn't really make sense to talk about what we have found in earlier Chinese history, which is many separate states. Here, you know, even though you have different societies that have developed, have their own institutions, their own organizations, their own developments. And some of these, of course, historically as well in other settings, the smaller units have been tremendously important for China's future. Just like I think Hong Kong and Taiwan, to some extent Singapore, are tremendously important for China's future today. But in terms of the sort of nationalism part of this, the concepts that come out of Chinese nationalism, very often, in almost all cases, they are directed in towards this gigantic Chinese state that actually exists at the moment. Whether that's bad or good, we don't know. I mean, we'll have to see, I guess, I mean, how that actually develops. Not all aspects of nationalism, very often when they call patriotism or love of country, not all of that is negative. But it only, it becomes negative when it is something that inspires you to act on behalf of your people, your unit, against others, to deal with things differently because they simply belong to your people or your group as opposed to other groups. That's when nationalism becomes a big problem. That hasn't happened, I think, in China yet, but it might happen in the future, because I see inside the PRC a very distinct, very strong development in the direction of a more European-style form of nationalism, which really refers to who you are and tries to limit what China is rather than expanding it. And that I see as problematic.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Bill Mack. I'm from the Department of Buddhist Studies. I was trained as a linguist and a philologist, and quite recently I was asked to write a book on the history of Buddhism in Hong Kong. And of course I found it an extremely daunting task. So I'm keen to hear some advice from you.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate what you mentioned about setting the priority.
Yeah.
So and you mentioned about you should bear in mind what matters to the readers, and that affect how you revise this edition. Could you say a few more words about that process? And also, do you have any advice for someone moving from philology to history?
I think that's a very fruitful way to move. I think many philologists, I mean, people who are trained in philology, make very good historians because they are sensitive to the use of and the significance, the meaning of terms, of phrases that have meant a lot for people over time. Historians, particularly 20th century historians, often have a tendency to, in my view, exaggerate history's materialism. I think if you look at history as a whole, ideas, concepts, religious values played an enormously important role. Trying to explain the history of the world, the development of the world, simply in materialist terms is to narrow it down and make some of it unrecognizable. Now, I think what you're engaged in terms of writing about Buddhism, is something that is very worthwhile. I mean, the study of religion in general, particularly the historical study of religion, is something that really has not developed as well as one should have hoped in the 20th century. Maybe simply because of what I've just said. I mean, the emphasis on material factors rather than idealistic or spiritual factors. So there's a lot that can be done there and ought to be done. I mean, with regard to China, for instance, I mean, when I was working on this book, when I was working on the revision, or even not just the revision, the writing of the chapters on China's early history, of course, I had to go back and read quite a bit of the new literature that is there, still in its infancy, I would say, both in English and Chinese. For instance, about the impact that Buddhism had in China at the end of the first millennium. And I think, you really need to look more closely at these kinds of things. You have to look at them, coming to the second part of your question, as human experience. Not just understand it in terms of its spiritual values, but also as a practice. I mean, as how people want to live their lives. And that is something that is connected to the setting of priorities that a world historian must have, or someone working on this kind of project must have. You do have to try at least to be reasonably clear to yourself about the significance that you give to people's choices. I mean, what they decide to do for whatever reason. They want to live their lives in a certain way. And then you have to try to work through history to try to explain some of this historically. Buddhism is a perfect case in point, I think, in terms of how it spread. It spread because it had values that spoke very directly to the people who were there at the time. That's the case for most great religions, although I know a few examples that are more apt than the Buddhist examples from that period, maybe particularly in the East Asian sense, from the 7th to the 9th, early 10th century. It is something that really is very, very significant and very meaningful. And then you try to learn from that also in thinking about how values spread today. I mean, how ideas and concepts and values spread today, and seeking then their historical origins, or thinking about their historical origins. That's part of that setting of priority that I was talking about.
I think you are taking up another big project in the, well, you've started on it already, which is a history of the battle between, I may have got this slightly wrong, the conflict between capitalism and socialism, or the competition during the 20th century. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it's a project I started a couple of years ago, and then a little bit too much university administration and a few other things got in the way for it, and I will be eternally grateful to this institution that I know been able to spend a few weeks getting back to it and looking at this again. Yeah, it is a history of the conflict between capitalism and socialism in the 20th century, possibly the long 20th century. It's a book that starts in the 1890s with the first global capitalist crisis, the radicalization of significant parts of the European labor movement, and the expansion of Russia and the United States into fully continental empires that took over most of what was available in terms of territory and settled that territory between their points of origin at one end of a continent and where they ended up at another end of the continent. Now, the latter is important because it created the states that came to engage in the Cold War. The former is important because it was about those values that were built, the points of view that were developed, that made this conflict so incredibly dramatic and so incredibly serious that it threatened to blow up the world. I think it's very hard to understand that if you only look at world history as it developed since 1945. And you have to understand the near desperation that many people thought of with regard to defending their political project because of the disasters that had happened in the first part of the 20th century. The two world wars, the interwar depression. This created people who were willing to take enormous chances in order to promote a system that they thought would save mankind. So that's the reason why I have a slightly different time span for this book than just, it's not, I mean, this book is very much a book about the Cold War, but it's about the Cold War in a much bigger setting than anything that I've done before. I've been joking with my students that this is my way of finally writing myself out of the Cold War, you know. And I can tell you absolutely that this will be the very last book that I will do that puts the Cold War at the center. Not because there's anything wrong in doing that. It's a very, very important, perhaps the most important historical study of international relations that we have now in terms of the materials that are still becoming available. Think about China and the Cold War, for instance. I mean, it's a field that is so underdeveloped that it's almost sort of beyond belief. So it's not because it's not important. It's because I've done enough of it myself, and someone else can continue to work on that. And I'd be much more interested, I think, over time to work on other aspects of history that has interested me. Maybe even go a little bit further back in time. But first and foremost, now it's this book about the conflict between ideologies in the 20th century and the disasters that led to.
Professor, my name is Terence Yao. I'm a Hong Kong U alumnus, from decades ago. Anyway, my question is following up on the aspect of Cold War. Although you mentioned you have a diminished interest in this subject, but if I may still take advantage of your knowledge and wisdom on this subject. Well, we all know that the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, right, in the 90s, But do you see any potential or possibilities, for the for a Cold War to recur like between the U.S. and North Korea, for example, or U.S. and China. You know, I'm just just taking examples from the air. So do you see any like I said, any potential, given your knowledge of the old or the past Cold War, are we free of this menace in future? Human race as a whole will be free of this menace of Cold War. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, there's good news and there's bad news, really, with regard to this, I think. I mean, the good news is that I think very few people who study the Cold War historically think that it will ever reappear in the form that it had back then. I mean, the root causes that I just talked about, the intensity of the ideological conflict, almost all of that is gone. I mean, that's not the same thing as saying that all forms of socialism are irrelevant today, but they play a different role from what was the case in the past. And it's very important, of course, that in my view, the two most significant powers in today's world, in a world that is already much more multipolar than the Cold War ever was, but the most important poles within that multipolar world may be the United States and China. And in many ways, certainly in terms of their economic systems, they are much more alike than any other relationship between a existing power and a rising power than we've seen in human history. Today's China may want more for China within the international system, but they don't want to turn the international system upside down. Quite on the contrary, they see a lot of benefits for themselves in that system that was created first by Britain and then by the United States. So in that sense, I see China more as a continuator power on these kinds of issues. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that conflict has come to an end, or as Frank Fukuyama is often misunderstood to have said, that history had, as such, any historical processes had come to an end. That was not what he meant. What he meant was something actually much closer to what I just said, that the great ideological battle of that particular era was over. So there will be conflict. I mean, it's almost clear, and you can just look around this region, that some of it will also be pretty intense conflict. But I doubt whether it will be a Cold War between the United States and China. North Korea is, in systemic terms, in broader terms, just too insignificant for there to be anything that could be characterized as an ongoing Cold War. But there is the enormous potential for conflict. There is, in North Korea, in my view, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, the potential that nuclear weapons could be used in anger in one form or another. I mean, of course, that's of enormous significance. But it's not a Cold War. So I think the historians of the future will have to learn a slightly different vocabulary with regard to this. But let me also say this, and since one of you asked before we started the session today, in terms of danger overall, since I've done so much work on the Cold War, are we now living in a time period where the global political constellations are less dangerous than what they were during the Cold War? And my answer to that is a definite yes. I mean, I think the world is, as a whole, a much safer place today than what it was during the Cold War. I mean, that's not the same thing as saying that terrible things do not happen and that people get killed in large numbers through bombings from the air or from terrorist attacks or from mad political projects that try to conquer territory or control people. But we are away from that danger that was specific to the Cold War, and that was massive strategic nuclear warfare between the two superpowers, which would have destroyed, if not humankind, at least any kind of civilization as we have known it. That is gone with the end of the Cold War. And that certainly has made, for wherever you live in the world, it's made it a safer place than what it was during the height of the Cold War conflict.
I'm Frederick Chen. I'm really an amateur in the study of history. But
We all are in many ways.
But I have a couple. I'll try a couple of questions, and I don't know if it's fair to ask historians about predicting the future. I'll try with a couple of questions because, like you mentioned earlier, that when we study history, we look at it from perhaps from different points of view, from different countries' point of view, cultures' point of view, from different perhaps religions' point of view. But as the world develops these days, it's getting so fast, the technology is so different, so that something happens in one part of the world immediately almost can spark a response from another part of the world which did not happen historically. Historically, maybe like a cultural an industrial revolution in Europe might affect China only years later. But these days, the impact's almost immediate. So my question is, when you, maybe in a couple more revisions of this book, do you see is it more difficult to write a book, or you see it's easier to make a revision because of the globalization? Or actually, my more broader question is, when we look at history, when we try to study how kinds of history, the development of human beings today, do we never take a new model to study it as we move on, or can we still stick by the original version, older versions of just looking at it from different points of views?
I think historians very often have opinions about the future. Well, one has to be careful is that those opinions ought not to be taken more seriously than anyone else's opinions about what the future might look like. I mean, historians have an advantage in the sense that we have we come from a starting point in terms of the work that we do that brings something different to the table from people who work in other fields of work or investigation. But we shouldn't think of ourselves as being in any way privileged by studying the past to be able to predict more accurately what happens in the future. And we have had plenty of opportunities to prove that that is not the case. So with that in mind, I mean, I think what we are seeing at the moment is on a global scale. I mean, it's a world that is becoming more unified and more diverse at the same time. I mean, it's a very complicated time period to catch, I think, when you look back at it from a few centuries hence. There is a lot of increase in terms of unity. I mean, think about young people today, the kind of, the music that they listen to, the fashions that they are preoccupied with, which, the videos that they watch on YouTube. In a flash, all of this, as you were indicating in your question, become global phenomenon. And people pick them up everywhere, especially younger people. But I mean, even that will change as technologies change and become more differentiated, making it simpler, I think, for many older people to participate in this as well. So on the one hand, things are becoming much more unified. Now, it is important, though, this is the historian speaking, to realize that that's a process that's been going on for quite some time. My favorite example to use for that is, of course, dress. I mean, the way people dress. If you look at us who are sitting here today and think about how a predominantly Chinese audience would have dressed, 100, 150 years ago, you get the sense of how that tendency towards unification, standardization, has spread over a fairly long period of time. So it isn't entirely new. But at the same time, some people, as I said when I was talking about Chinese nationalism, for instance, or nationalism in other parts, or religious fundamentalism, become increasingly preoccupied with defending what they see as exclusively theirs, that belong to the group that they belong to, and that they are very afraid will be taken away from them in one form or another. Now, it's not very difficult, as a number of fabulous historical sociologists who worked on these kinds of phenomena have reminded us, to see that these different processes may be part of a unified pattern in a certain way. You know, the more of an intensity you have in terms of what some people call globalization, the more important it also becomes for some people to defend what they see as theirs. It's not a new process. It also has been going on for some time. But it's with regard to these kinds of groups where I think that technology and the evolving technology will probably play a very, very important role. I mean, more important than it will for humanity as a whole. Because if you have a message that defines a group up in opposition against what you can imagine these people at least present as going on at the global or international level, it's much easier to get an audience for that today than what used to be the case in the past, because you can spread your message, even if it's a message about particularity, in ways that just wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. And this is, of course, the experience that you see with everyone from Islamist jihadists to Chinese nationalists or Japanese nationalists for that matter, on the conflict on the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands. Now, how that is going to end up is very difficult to foretell. I mean, what I know is that the attempts at limiting this through forms of censorship or control are bound to fail. Where I think you can develop a resistance, which I think is necessary against these forms of identity gone wild, if you can call it that, is through attempting to engage people who hold these views in some form of dialogue. I mean, I know that is very difficult to do, particularly if same people are out to kill you. But it is still probably the only way in which that's possible to be dealt with. I mean, think about the relationship between China and Japan today, in free fall in so many different ways. You know, if you just leave to the most extreme elements in both countries to deal with the contradictions that exist between them, you're not going to get anywhere. You know, and so you have to, you have to be willing to look at some of the more extreme propaganda that is there and discuss it and eventually confront it and come up with alternative values and alternative ways of looking at this. That I do think is becoming more important. Ignoring it is not a good idea and won't be helpful. So that's some of the trends that I see. I mean, where it all goes is very, very difficult to say. And someone who's worked through world history in terms of trying to put together a new book about it is probably about the last person that one should ask, about the future, because you see so many conflicting trends, so many ways in which the current world has been created that, or maybe that's an advantage, at least you're very open to the world going in very many different directions in the future as well. I mean, it tells you, that's maybe what history does best, is to tell you about the humility with which you must hold your opinions, even if you hold them very, very strongly, about what is going to work, say 50 or 100 years from now.
Right, well, you have now been answering questions for something like an hour and a half. We may stay a little longer informally, but tonight is actually Arne's last night in Hong Kong. He's got a plane at 12:30 tonight. So instead of being Cinderella and having to get out before the stroke of midnight from here, we've got a car picking us up at 9:30 to go to the airport. So there may be a little time still for you to chat informally. but I think that I'm, at this stage, going to draw this session to a close. I see some faces in the audience tonight who were here for Arne's first lecture just over 3.5 weeks ago. I can't quite believe that he arrived on April Fool's Day. I hope there was no particular significance in that. In some ways, it seems a very short time. In other ways, quite a lot has gone on in that time. I think it's certainly been a rather busy time for us, but I'm very pleased that Arne finished up here in the library tonight, because I think perhaps some of your happiest moments in Hong Kong have been spent here. We owe a great deal to the library and its fantastic staff, and so I'm very pleased that we were able to finish up your first trip here, speaking here tonight. I should also say, keep on watching this space. Arne is going to be coming back for the next 3.5 years at intervals of about 6 months. We don't know yet exactly what he's going to do on every trip. Arne is one of the few academics I know who's rather like an opera star, in that he gets scheduled for months and even years in advance, and has a lady in London who spends all her time working on his schedule. When he gets away
He
from
does a very
her,
good job of it.
when he gets away from her and forgets to tell her, then he starts getting himself double booked, as he nearly did just one evening that I know of, here in Hong Kong. But he will be coming back. As you see, he's extremely approachable. He's been spending a lot of his time in Hong Kong U, making appointments to talk to students, undergraduates, graduate students, academics here about their work. I trusted him to schedule himself for that. And sometimes it was the students who stood him up, because they've got very, very busy schedules.
Very.
And finding time to talk to Arne was sometimes more than they could manage. But thank you very much, Arne, for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it here. We've certainly, I think, enjoyed having you here. We're looking forward to having you back again for the next 3.5 years. Research at Hong Kong U may never be quite the same again. That's why this scheme was invented.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. It's been wonderful.
Once again, let's thank Professor Roberts and Professor Restek.
Thank you.
On behalf of the library, may I present a little souvenir to Professor Restek? It's a little book. I think some way to your luggage.
Thank you very much. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you so
Just a
much.
photo.
We need a photo.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
This brings an end to tonight's book talk.